Hello and welcome to this webinar on T-levels. Today I'm going to cover a few areas. I'm going to give an overview of the T-level programme in general and a quick look at the NCFE qualifications within the T-level routes in particular. Before we start, I would like to take a quick poll of those watching to get a sense of how confident you feel in your current knowledge of T-levels. That should be appearing for you now, so I'll give you a moment to respond. Okay, thank you for answering honestly. Hopefully over the next hour you'll get much more of an idea about T-levels in general. There'll be opportunities to ask questions throughout and I'll come to those at the end. Okay. So, as you'll have heard, we were awarded the contract to be delivery partner for 6 T-levels. And those were across 3 different subject area routes. And these were education and childcare, health and science, and digital. As I mentioned before, I'll be looking at T-levels in a broad sense so that you get an idea about the structure of the T-level programme. And then towards the end, we'll look at the NCFE qualifications across each of the subject areas. And while we're getting to grips with the T-level programme, I'll be using childcare and education as an illustrative example, just so that we can get a good idea of what the T-level programme might look like more concretely. But just as a little disclaimer, for all of those examples that I use for education and childcare, all of those are for illustration purposes only. A lot of the specific details are subject to change because this qualification is still in development. But it is nonetheless quite useful just to have a little look at where that is at the moment. So I'll begin with some of the background and the motivating context for T-levels, just so that the intention and purpose of those qualifications is really clear as we go along. And I think it's also quite interesting just to get up to speed with the behind the scenes developments that happen way before anyone even hears about the T-levels. And once we've got an idea of that motivating context, I'll then break down the programme structure and we'll start getting into the details of what a T-level is. So here you can see a little timeline of all of the major steps that have led to the T-level project. And this started in 2016 with the independent panel overseen by Lord Sainsbury, which recommended reform of the technical education sector to ensure that technical education was on par with the academic track. The post-16 skills plan accepted all of those recommendations that came out of the Sainsbury review, and that included the development of a new flagship qualification. And so that flagship qualification was given more shape in 2017 with the T-level action plan, which was released. And in 2018, the government response to the consultations set out the policy on the design of the TQ, and the regulations for that were signed off by Ofqual. In 2019, the awarding organisations applied to be delivery partners for the technical qualifications, and these were awarded to 3 awarding organisations: NCFE, City and Guilds and Pearson. And of course my focus is going to be on the NCFE qualifications today. In 2020, this is when the first 3 routes will be ruled out, and these are education and childcare, which is brought to you by NCFE Cash, construction and digital. Following that will be the Wave 2 rollout of T-level qualifications, which includes legal, finance and accounting, engineering and manufacturing, health and science and digital, with the latter 2 also being brought to you by NCFE. And in 2022, the rest of the subjects for T-levels will be rolled out, and the expectation is that most providers will be delivering T-levels by about 2024. So that is a little look ahead about where this is going. And I think the expectation is that T-levels will be the new standard for level 3 technical qualification. So I've mentioned the TQ, the technical qualification, and the T-level in explaining this, and I'll explain what those mean now. What you can see here is a representation of the whole T-level programme. So in order for a student to achieve a whole T-level, they need to fulfil at least 4 components, and I'll go through these in sequence now. The top 2 components you can see together form what's called the technical qualification. For the rest of this webinar, I'll probably just refer to this as the TQ. So if I say TQ, this is what I mean. It's the core and the occupational specialisms together. And these form the bulk of the teaching hours for a T-level programme. So as you can see, that can range between 900 and 1400 hours. I'll go through each of these and explain what they entail with a bit more detail. So starting with the core, this refers to the knowledge and understanding and conceptual underpinning that students will need in order to be successful as they go on with the rest of the qualification. So these are the theoretical principles that are relevant to the subject area and to the broader route. So the core applies to the subject area in general and the pathway that they're on specifically. And this can take between 20 and 50% of the total qualification time. The core is assessed with by two means that I'll talk about in more detail in a bit. There's an external assessment component for the core and an employer set project. The rest of the TQ is made up by the occupational specialisms, which can comprise 50 to 80% of the total qualification time. And this is skills based, and really what this is really geared towards is getting those behaviours and what the threshold competence for employment in the subject sector relevant to the specific T level. Where it's relevant, the maths, English and ICT skills will be integrated with the occupational specialism content. And so where the core is knowledge and understanding focused, the occupational specialisms are really focused on knowledge and skills. So the occupational specialisms, because they're skill-based, may run alongside the industry placement, which is the other foundational component of the T-level programme. And the industry placement, which is mandatory for all of the T-levels, must be with an external employer. So that is an employer who is external to the provider, the college or the school, who are delivering the T-level programme. And the intention with this is that students are able to develop skills and apply them in the workplace environment to help them reach employability by the time they leave the T-level programme. And that mandatory placement has to be a minimum of 315 hours. There may be some variation with that depending on the specific subject area, but the minimum is 315 hours. An exit requirement of the T-level programme is the Maths and English, which is the centre panel there. And this requirement is level 2, which can be fulfilled either by GCSEs or level 2 functional skills. There may be some higher requirements if they're required for a specific subject area. And also for your SEND learners, the exit requirement for Maths and English is entry level 3. So there's a little bit of flexibility there to meet the needs of the learners. And other requirements refers to any professional registration or any additional requirements that might be needed for employability in a specific sector. So particularly with routes like construction in 2020, or to meet the full and relevant criteria to be counted in staff-child ratios for education and childcare. These are the additional requirements that might be included in the T-level programme, so that the students leave the programme able to potentially enter the world of work straight away. So that's an overview of everything required for the T-level programme. And moving, I'll just finish this section and then answer the questions that are coming in about the T-level programme. So just for a bit of clarification, I've mentioned the employer-set project and the industry placement so far. And it's worth taking a moment to make clear the points of involvement for employers during the development of the qualification and its delivery. So the T-level panels were part of the T-level action plan and the outline content produced for each qualification. This was commissioned by IFATE, and that involves professional organisations, employers, and providers who set out what's necessary for employability and threshold competence in a particular area. The employer-set project involves a different set of employers where the awarding organisations collaborate with employers in formulating the assessments, which are then delivered by the providers. And the industry placement is a third set of employers. The industry placement employers aren't expected to formulate any assessments for the students, and they are non-overlapping sets of employers. But this is part of the intention with the whole T-level programme, is that employers are central to the whole thing. So moving on, just for a quick note of funding, and then I'll get to your questions once I've finished this little section. The funding is allocated on an annual basis for T-levels, and this comes from a couple of different dedicated pots of funding. So for the T-level, this funding is divided into 4 different bands based on the size of the T-level programme over 2 years, and it's paid in yearly instalments. So as you can see, there is small, medium, large and very large bands, and the band 7 there is highlighted just as for an example. The education and childcare T-level is expected to fall within this band. And as you can see, the whole funding rate is at 9,670, which is paid in half instalments per year. This also applies to the industry placement payment, which at 550 is paid with 275 in the first year and 275 in the second year. And this applies whether or not the industry placement actually takes place in the first year or the second year. And likewise, the funding for the T-level is allocated regardless of the planned hours in each year. So this fixed rate is intended to make sure that the money is available when it's needed, and also to help the administration of this in the early rollout. So on the left of the screen here, you can see a combination of planned TQ hours, and this includes employability, enrichment and pastoral requirements, which are the centres can decide on what they're going to use for that. There are no hours and funding on this example for level 2 maths and English if it's needed, but that's available from a separate funding source. And those 3 elements on the left equal 1,450 hours, and when you add the placement to that, that takes it up to 1,800, which is what you expect for the whole T-level. So on the right of the screen there, you can see that there's no industry placement in the first year, which is the top half of the table, and all of the industry placement is happening in the second year on the bottom half of the table. And the planned hours for the TQ are asymmetrical across those 2 halves, But as you can see, the annual rate for Band 7 T-levels and the industry placement is paid in those fixed instalments per year. So with that little overview of the T-level programme out of the way, I'll take a moment just to have a look at the questions and offer some clarification where I can. Okay, so one question that's come in from Paul, what happens if a learner does not have level 2 maths or English? I'll talk about partial attainment later on in the webinar, but just the short answer to that is you can't achieve a full T level without the exit requirement of level 2 maths or English. This can be, it would come up on a statement of achievement what the learner has achieved. They are able to pass the TQ, but they wouldn't be able to attain a full T level. Another question from Paul is the SEND entry level 3 exit requirement for both English and maths? Yes. So that entry level 3 for SEND learners applies to both English and maths. The funding for maths and English, there is funding for maths and English. As I understand it, this comes from the existing funding available for on a centre level, but more detail than that, I'll have to get back to you and double check this, because I know there was some ambiguity about the provision for maths and English funding. So that I will provide more detail and get back to you when I can find out exactly what the situation is with that. Okay. So moving on to the technical qualification, that's that TQ part of the programme. We'll look at that in a bit more detail. On your screen, you should be able to see an overview of that. So there's the core component there and the occupational specialisms. And just to refresh, the core is about theoretical and conceptual understanding, and the occupational specialisms are more geared towards skills and threshold competence for the industry. And as I mentioned earlier, the core is assessed with an external assessment and employer set project. And the assessments I'm going to go into in quite a bit of detail. And the occupational specialisms, because they're skills-based, are graded with a more synoptic assessment, and this will vary according to the requirements of the subject area. And I'll talk a little bit more about using education and childcare as an illustrative example for these, because it helps to make that a bit more concrete. Your core is graded A* to E, and the occupational specialisms are graded pass merit distinction, and the proportions of the entire TQ taken up by core and occupational specialism respectively can vary according to the T-level programme. And again, I'll be using education and childcare as just one example of what that proportion split might look like. So just with those fields filled in with the specifics for education and childcare, this gives you an idea of what's involved. So one of the changes you can see there is that the occupational specialisms have 3 defined routes for education and childcare. So these are early years education, childcare, assistant teaching, and mentoring students in further and higher education. For this TQ, the learners can choose one occupational specialism, and as you can see in that final column, this will take up 60% of their qualification time. So within the bands defined by the T-level panels and by Ofqual, the awarding organisations, NCFE in this case, have decided on a 40-60 split between the core and the occupational specialisms. And within that, the assessments for the core, that external assessment consists of external examinations for education and childcare, but they needn't for other T-level programmes. The external assessment refers to the fact that all of the assessments need to be externally marked, but invigilation and exam conditions are a different consideration that will be made sort of in response to the requirements of the subject area. The practical assignments for education childcare at the moment loosely follow a plan, do, review format, but this is subject to change. So that is a slightly more concrete example of what those abstract requirements for the TQ might look like. So I said I would talk about the assessments in a bit more detail. And before I move on to that, we've had a question come on, so I'll just have a quick check about that and offer some clarification. So Patricia asks, is the external exam fixed dates or flexible? At the moment, I think the thinking around this for education and childcare specifically, but not necessarily every T level, is that those external assessments will have fixed windows where they have to take place. But the details of that are still being worked out. So really, there's no final word on that until spring next year. At the moment, though, I think the idea is to have a fixed window in June, and that those would apply in year 1 and in year 2 to provide the possibility of a resit. Okay, so moving on to look at the assessments in a bit more detail. On your screen at the moment are the assessment objectives for the core external assessment, so just that one part of the core assessments. And these apply to all of the T-level programmes. So across these three, the weightings of the assessment objectives are determined by the awarding body who are responsible for delivering the TQ. The three that apply to all T-level programmes are to demonstrate knowledge and understanding of the content. Remember, that's the focus of that core component. To apply that knowledge and understanding of the content in different situations and contexts, which is really to try and capture a more deeper learning at level 3. So rather than simply being able to retain the knowledge, being able to apply it means that that conceptual underpinning is really well suited to going on into more skills-based work in the occupational specialisms. And the third assessment objective, to analyse and evaluate information and issues related to the content, opens the door to more academic-based skills and more of those classroom-based skills that mean that the T-level lends itself to maybe a bit more flexibility in the progression routes compared to other options at level 3. So the core external assessment is fully compensatory across those assessment objectives. In other words, there's no minimum mark needed for each one. And this external assessment can take between 60 and 75% of the core. I'll give a more concrete example of what that looks like with respect to education and childcare in a moment, but that is the window set by Ofqual. And as a result of this, because the core can't exceed 50% of the total qualification time, and because the external assessment can only take between 60 and 75% of that, the consequence is that this external assessment can only account for up to 1/3 of the marks for the whole TQ. So that could provide some reassurance for students who may be experiencing some anxiety around this external assessment part of the core, which is perhaps more using the academics and classroom skills than other qualifications at level 3 outside of the A levels. The second part of assessment for the core is the employer set project, which is assessed according to the objectives you can see on the screen in front of you. So these are to plan an approach to meet a brief, and this brief is formulated in collaboration with employers to make sure that it really meets a real world scenario, something that is practically minded and that bears some relevance for employability in the sector as it is. The student needs to be able to select relevant techniques and resources to meet a brief. So again, geared towards those skills that will be coming up in the occupational specialism, the ability to apply the appropriate knowledge and skills and realise a project brief and evaluate the outcome. And those maths, English and digital skills are integrated where necessary in the assessments. And the employer set project will at the moment for education and childcare will consist of projects that broadly align with the 3 occupational specialism pathways that apply. So that early years assisting, teaching and mentoring students pathways. Again, fully compensatory. So across these assessment objectives, there's no minimum mark needed for each one. And the structure of it is fully compensatory, which I'll illustrate in a moment. Again, the weightings for each of these are set by the awarding organisations, but at least 50% of that weighting must be on assessment objective 2. So that's the ability to select relevant techniques and resources to meet the brief. And the off-call guide for this is between 25 and 40% of the core. So this is what that whole assessment structure looks like for the core. And as you can see, those 3 assessment objectives for the external exams are fully compensatory and lead to 1 mark that covers all 3 of them. And similarly for the employer set project, you end up with 1 mark that covers all 5 assessment objectives. And then those 2 marks are fully compensatory with each other. And this is where your A star to E mark is derived for the core overall. So from each assessment objective up to that overall core grade, the assessment structure is fully compensatory. The occupational specialisms are worked out in a similar way, but this is across performance outcomes. So again, because the emphasis is on behaviours and skills needed for threshold competence, the occupational specialisms are assessed according to performance outcomes. And this is a fully compensatory structure across multiple practical assignments. And these, depending on the subject area, this might entail observations of those skills. As I mentioned earlier, for education and childcare, at the moment these loosely follow a plan-do review format with multiple assignments. And each of those assignments cover all of the performance outcomes so that they can be assessed in a synoptic fashion. NCFE will be providing guide exemplification for these assignments to give the providers some idea of what needs to be produced for each of those. And so again, this is just a little illustration of that fully compensatory structure. So for each set of assignments, you'll end up with a mark that covers all of the performance outcomes, and then all of those are fully compensatory with each other. And from that, your pass, merit or distinction mark is derived. And that's done by the awarding organisation because all of these are externally assessed. So this is for illustration purposes only, and it's just a look at what this all looks like in practice. So for education and childcare, what you're seeing on the screen is a breakdown of the whole assessment for all of the assessments for the TQ and how much of the TQ is accounted for by each one. So the core and occupational specialisms are a 40-60 split for education and childcare, which you can see there. And that 40% of the core, 70% of it is accounted for by the external exams, and 30% of it is accounted for by the employer set project. And as I mentioned earlier, those external exams in this case account for 28%, so less than a third of the whole TQ. And the remaining 60% is accounted for by the practical assignments for the occupational specialisms. Moving on to the grading for the whole TQ, having explained how the A star to E mark and the PMD mark are each derived, the question is then, well, what happens with both of those in order to get an overall mark for the T level? And this is the answer. These are the lookup tables that have been released by DFE. And where those cells, where the pass, merit and distinction bands fall in those cells will vary depending on the proportion of core to occupational specialism. So because there's some flexibility with this, those boundaries are going to move a bit. So on the far left, you can see what the lookup table would look like for a 50-50 split. So at the moment, I believe the construction TQ, which is due to launch in September 2020, has a 50-50 structure, and this is the lookup table for that qualification. In the centre, enlarged, is the 40-60 split table, and at the far right you can see a 30-70 split, which is a different extreme. In each case, the distinction star category is reserved just for those students who achieve an A star on the core and a distinction on the occupational specialisms. So where the pass boundaries may change a bit depending on the proportions, for all of the T levels, it's only possible to get that distinction star if you get those two grades. You may also notice that the minimal requirement for a pass for a TQ is an E on the core and a pass on the occupational specialism, and that's the case for all of the proportion possibilities. Okay, so moving on to the certificates for this. These are issued by IFATE, who oversee all of the T-level programmes. So regardless of the awarding organisation who is responsible for this subject-specific TQ, the certificates for the whole T-level are issued by IFATE, and this is a sample of what those may look like. As you can see, for a full T-level, all 4 components are displayed on the certificate. So here you can see a core has been assessed with a grade B and the occupational specialism assessed with a merit, resulting in an overall mark of merit for the certificate. The health and safety, in this case for construction, is part of the additional requirements that are needed just for that subject. And there's also a statement that the student has completed the industry placement, which will have been a minimum of 315 hours, and also met that exit requirement for English and maths. Note also that they don't state the level for English and maths for the exit requirement, and this is because it can vary for SEND learners. And there's helpful information on the back with the lookup tables and UCAS tariffs, which I'll talk about in a second. As we mentioned earlier, if the necessary components aren't met, the student will receive a statement of achievement, which will look like this. In this case, you can see that the student has achieved a grade B on the core, but hasn't finished their occupational specialism, and so there's no grade awarded for that. And they've completed their additional requirement of the health and safety certificate, but they haven't finished the work placement. So what you see here is just a statement that they've done the English and maths. And the clarification about what the statement of achievement is stated on the back there, that this isn't a full T level. So on the note of the industry placement, just a quick word for that. As I mentioned, this is overseen by IFATE rather than as opposed to the TQ, which is the responsibility of the awarding organisations. But the student will be observed during their placement in order to demonstrate their threshold competence. And just as I mentioned before, these employers aren't responsible for formulating assessments, but they might be expected to contribute to some learning outcomes for the student, especially because I know one of the intentions for the T-level is that these industry placements are of high quality, which is also why there's a restriction on where they need to be. Just had a question coming in there asking if the industry placement has to take place in year 2. No, the industry placement can take place either in year 1 or year 2. And especially for some of those, I know there's a bit of concern to make sure that students have the opportunity to choose to find out what they like and make an informed choice about their occupational specialism pathway. So it's up to the centre how this is delivered in sequence. Some of it can be delivered in year 1, some of it can be delivered in year 2. In addition to this, if the student goes on any taster sessions, they can carry over up to 35 hours of those taster sessions to count towards their industry placement for the T level. So there's quite a bit of flexibility there for the centres and for the students. As I mentioned, NCFE isn't responsible for the industry placement, but we do have resources that can help centres with their delivery of this and with their organisation of this, and with other aspects of the T-level as a whole. So on your screen, you can see a prototype interface for our MyT platform. And the MyT platform consists of 5 different apps which can help with different components of the T-level programme. You don't have to have all of them. You can have access to MyT and just buy the app that you require. There's no minimum number of these you would need to have. There's quite a bit of excitement about the Go Career app at the moment, which is a career guidance tool and work placement management tool. And this can be signed into by the students, by the centres and by the employers, and can help with the tracking and sign off of those industry placements to make sure that the requirements are met. Platform 1 is an e-learning platform which houses sort of professionally developed blended learning materials and has an e-portfolio facility. And Skills Forward can help with the maths and English provision that's needed for the T-level as well. It contains diagnostic tools and e-learning resources for maths and English and ICT. We have Peers, which is a tutoring and mentoring platform which enables peer-to-peer, employer-to-learner and tutor-to-learner mentoring, and is geared towards widening access to extra tutoring that students might need. And finally, there's Cash Alumni, which is going to be particularly relevant for those delivering education and childcare or any pathways on the health and science route. This is an online professional membership network and it's free to join. So I would recommend signing up with that just with an email address. That's all you need. And having a look at the resources held in there. There's a good podcast. Actually, I should say an award-winning podcast, and Cash Alumni has recently won a lot of awards in 2019, so definitely check it out. That's free to join. So I'm going to end this T-level overview with a little note on progression. So part at the beginning, part of the intention for this T-level project was to give students a technical education option that was on a par with the academic track of A-levels into higher education, but also made them work ready. So where your A-levels would prepare a student for an academic higher education path, and your apprenticeships are strictly vocational and prepare the learner for entry into the workplace, the T-level potentially grants progression to all 3. So in the case of higher level apprenticeships, for education and childcare, you might go on to an advanced practitioner apprenticeship or children's residential care, for example, or you might go straight into employment, and depending on the occupational specialism that was chosen for this, it could be in early years as an early years practitioner or assistant or educator, or as a teaching assistant or learning mentor, career coach, all of those kinds of occupations. In addition to a high-level apprenticeship or an occupation, a T-level does attract a UCAS tariff, and on the right of the screen there you'll be able to see the UCAS points that have been assigned to each T-level overall grade. Now these were decided by looking at the number of UCAS points awarded for 3 A-levels in the bands you can see there. And the motivation for this was really that the T-level qualification is equivalent to 3 A-levels in its size and rigour. And so a distinction star T-level, if you'll remember, reserved just for those students who get A star on the core and distinction in the occupational specialism, they will receive UCAS points that are equivalent to 3 A-levels at A star. And there are a number of natural progression routes for those doing education and childcare in higher education. Any bachelor's degree around early years, early childhood studies, education and primary education, for example, any of those would be a natural progression route for someone with that T-level. So it's kind of in the design of the T-level to enable potentially any of those 3 pathways for students who hold a full qualification. I'm going to pause at this point and just check the time. If there are any questions, please do feel free to ask them. And if we have time, I'll move on with a quick overview of the specific qualifications that NCFE will be delivering in 2020 and 2021. So I'll just leave a little moment there for anyone to ask questions. So one question that's come in is, if my centre don't want to deliver a T-level, can we still deliver level 3 applied generals? And the answer is yes for the time being. Over time and between now and around 2024, a number of level 3 qualifications will be having their funding withdrawn, particularly if there's duplication in the market, which was really one of the big recommendations that came out of the 2016 Sainsbury review. At the moment, those level 3 qualifications can be delivered either alongside the T-level if the centre is rolling it out already, or can just be delivered without a T-level if the centre isn't approved for that in the early stages of rollout. But this is a phased rollout over the next few years, and at the moment, yes, those other level 3 qualifications can still be delivered. I don't think there are any other questions coming in. So just with the remaining 10 to 15 minutes, I'll give you a quick whistle-stop tour of the NCFE qualifications that are part of that Wave 1 and Wave 2 rollout for T-levels. And this is just to give you a bird's eye view of what's going to happen. As I've mentioned already, we've got the education and childcare. And you've already seen this, so I won't labour it for too long. But just a little bit more detail about what's involved in each of those components for the TQ. These are the 12 elements of core knowledge needed for the T-level in education and childcare. So all of these 12 elements will be delivered in the classroom. And as part of our supportive resources, these are going to be grouped into cohesive themes that make them a bit easier to deliver. So there'll be one unique theme per term and 2 themes that run throughout the whole programme. These are the 3 occupational specialisms that we've already mentioned, so I won't spend much longer on those. For the health and science route, there are 3 different pathways, each of which the TQ for each of these will be delivered by NCFE. So these 3 pathways within health and science are health, healthcare science, and science. And each of these will involve a shared core, which is common to all of the pathways on the route. In addition to that, there's pathway-specific core, which is for each of the individual tracks that the student is on. And then there are occupational specialisms involved in all of these. So really the thing to note here is that while for education and childcare, that's the only pathway for that route. In routes where you have multiple pathways, there is core content that is common to all of them, and that you would need for any of them. The occupational specialisms for health include dental nursing and a range of options for supporting healthcare teams. So supporting the adult nursing team, midwifery, supporting the theatre team, supporting mental health teams, supporting the care of children and young people, and supporting therapy teams. For healthcare science, these occupational specialisms are optical care services, prosthetic and orthotic services, pharmacy, assisting with healthcare sciences and dental technical services. And for science, you have lab sciences, food sciences, animal sciences, and metrology. So quite a range of options there across the health and science route for students. For digital, the first pathway of the digital route is part of that 2020 rollout and is being delivered by Pearson. And as of 2021, the other 2 pathways of digital will come online, which are going to be delivered by NCFE. And as with health and science, this will involve a shared core, which is common to all of the digital pathways. included, and that's regardless of which awarding organisation is responsible for each individual TQ. And there will also be pathway-specific core for each of the digital pathways and occupational specialisms for each one. I misspoke there. Digital Business Services only has the shared core and the occupational specialisms. And this is just a little look at the occupational specialisms for each one. As you can see for Digital Business Services, this is just the data technician pathway. And for Digital Support Services, you have 4 options: digital support, unified communications, network cabling, and digital infrastructure. So that is just a quick overview of all of the NCFE qualifications. I can see that there's a question coming there, so if my cursor appears, I will have a look at that. So question from Paul, is it true that NCFE are sharing joint delivery of the new digital T level? How is that going to work? So just for clarification on that, the core component that is shared across pathways, NCFE will be working with, so I'm just going to try and move that back so that we can have a look at it on the screen as I'm talking. So that shared digital core, NCFE are in conversation with Pearson about the development of this, but there will be probably variation between the award organisations. The salient part of that is that they're derived from the same material, and what that looks like specifically isn't final at this point, as this is still in development. In terms of how it'll work, really the awarding organisations will supply the required material for their pathway, but it's in the development of this, there will be cooperation and collaboration between the awarding organisations to make sure that the same shared content is present for all of those. I think we've got a couple of minutes left, so if there are any other questions, please do feel free to ask them now. Or follow-up questions if the answers aren't quite what you were after. Okay, so thank you very much for your attendance. If there are any questions that occur to you afterwards, please do feel free to follow up with me and I'll help out as best I can. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you very much.